to suffer the unfinished processes of empire. The geographies of such violence extend across the map and into British anthropology, just as the exclusion, violence, and racism of colonialism endure across time into this disciplinary present. As we assemble virtually around the department and the museum in Cambridge, let us try to relocate how we understand anthropology in time and space, and how we hold it, and thus ourselves, to account. This is a first attempt at acknowledging the sheer loss, horror, and enduring harm that the theft of artifacts has wrought and continues to exert upon descendant and survivor communities around the world. The scale of this violence is immense, and so much remains untold. Stolen knowledge, stolen art, stolen human bodies, stolen climate, stolen dignity, and stolen humanity constitute and dominate the unfinished history of extractivist imperialism and anti-Black violence in museums and universities across North America and Europe, including here at Cambridge. For more than 5 centuries, Indigenous and marginalized communities resisting the processes of cultural domination exported by the global North have been met with killing, displacement, and dispossession. We affirm our solidarity with all those working to use anthropology for the purposes of anti-racism and anti-colonialism, for honesty and accountability, towards justice, reparations, and repair, and against white supremacy in all its forms. Acknowledgements mean nothing without action. We encourage all attendees and participants of this lecture to join us in our commitment not only to push the ontological boundaries of our discipline, but also to take part in the urgent work of actively confronting and dismantling anthropology's white infrastructure. British anthropology was always at a minimum 1 part extractivist to 1 part settler colonialist. In these urgent times, striving for equitable processes of acknowledging all that British anthropology has extracted from the world and all that it continues to extract is one place to start.
On behalf of the Cambridge University Social Anthropology Society, we'd like to welcome everyone to the 10th annual edition of the Strathern Lecture series. While we're disappointed not to be able to host you in person this year, we really appreciate everyone who's joining us virtually tonight. For those of you who don't know, the annual Strathern Lecture was established in 2011 to celebrate the many achievements of Dame Marilyn Strathern, former William Wyse Professors of Social Anthropology at Cambridge and former Mistress of Girton College here in Cambridge. Marilyn's work has proved widely influential in anthropology and other related disciplines, garnering many awards and distinctions that include the Huxley Memorial Medal, bestowed by the Royal Anthropological Institute for lifetime achievement at the highest level. We are absolutely delighted to have Marilyn join us for tonight's lecture, which is not only a celebration of her many achievements, but also an expression of the affection and esteem in which she's held within this department. Before we introduce our lecturer, I'd like to outline a few notes about the structure of tonight's event. After completing our introductory remarks, we will move into the main presentation, during which, out of respect for our lecturer, none of our attendees will be able to unmute themselves or access their respective chat functions. If you encounter any problems during the lecture, you should email qsas@socanth.cam.ac.uk. As soon as the presentation has ended, we will enter a brief Q&A period during which attendees will be able to submit their questions and comments. Unfortunately, due to the size and time constraints of this event, questions will be chosen and relayed by members of the QSAS Executive Committee. And also, as a final note, we are recording this evening's lecture. However, we will not be recording the Q&A session. So if you do know of anyone who was not able to be here with us tonight, they will be able to watch a future upload of this lecture on YouTube. Tonight's lecture will be delivered by Professor Dan Hicks on the title A Dead White Man. Dan is a professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford, curator of world archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and a fellow of St. Cross College. He was visiting professor at the Musée de Quai Branly from 2017 to 2018. And during that time, he was awarded the Rivers Medal of the Royal Anthropological Society. He's written extensively on material, culture, landscape, colonialism, art, and the history of archaeology and anthropology. His most recent book, The Brutish Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, was published by Pluto Press in November 2020 to critical acclaim and was listed as one of the New York Times best art books of 2020. We here at QCS believe that Dan is a critical and compassionate voice for these unsettling times, and we are delighted to welcome him here this evening. So without further ado, we will hand it over to Dan.
Okay, wonderful. And so it's absolutely wonderful to be here. It's an honor to be speaking here and to follow in the footsteps of so many who've given these lectures, and for also to be able to give this with Marilyn here as well. So I'm going to be talking about the decolonization of anthropology. And I guess really my main argument will be that I'm going to try to convince you that we need to learn from what is happening in anthropology institutions at the moment, which hold objects and ancestral remains in the museums, you know, actually about how the decolonization of our discipline might work. So the predicament in which we find ourselves in the museums, you know, is one which is shared with anthropology as a field, as a whole. So I'm not going to talk about the things I've written recently. This is going to be an attempt to say something new, but it is aiming to build on some ideas that have been important to me in some things that I've recently written. So in the book about the museums, I guess one thing I say in that book is that sense that, you know, every year when we introduce anthropological material culture studies, we use with no hint of irony a book that's called PSA on the Gift, whereas so many of the institutions in which, actually, I mean, which we have sort of made in order to look at objects, understand them, are filled with things that were taken under very different historical conditions. So we need a theory of sort of taking, which in the book I aim to link between the taking of a photograph and the taking of an object. So that sense in which a museum can make certain things endure. So maybe anthropology has something to learn from that, but maybe also there's something we can learn from the work that we did on the Calais site of the jungle in 2019, where the motto of that book was that as the border is to the nation state, so the museum is to empire. And I think, you know, actually in that enormously important acknowledgement that we heard at the outset here, which was an understanding and a recognition of the fact that the wider geographies of anthropology and the museum and the discipline are not simply contained within nation states. That's the same for institutions, and maybe it's the same for knowledge. So it was that sense in which the border, like the museum, is a device for classifying different sorts of humanity. And in many ways, this talk is about humanity and in all its forms. So sorry, I've just somehow clicked on that. There we go. So it's also a talk about a paper that I wrote about 10 years ago or so about how the four-field model of anthropology was invented here at the founding of the Pitt Rivers in 1882. And in that paper, I was aiming to show that the conventional narrative that we're told about four-field anthropology, you know, actually has an earlier history. And, you know, here at the museum, we arguably saw the birth of that form of anthropology. So I want to try and think about, you know, actually how, if we're facing up to some of anthropology's histories, then the relationship with the museum, you know, actually has a central relationship to knowledge in that sense as well. And fundamentally, there's another book as well, which is in the background here, which is the work I recently undertook on the photographic. And on the left-hand side, I've actually cropped this so we don't have to look at the dead white man at the heart of this sort of lecture himself. But there is the death photo of the founder of this museum. And in my work on the photographic, I've essentially picked a fight with the usual suspects on the photographic. If you go to Berger, if you go hang on, are you able to hear me? Sorry, I got a thing there that said I was
Sorry,
muted.
Dan, you were muted for a second, but I think you're back.
Okay, fine. So, okay, if I go back to the start of this one. So here is a death photograph of Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers. So I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I'm interested in how we think about the dead white man at the heart of this sort of lecture in terms of the photographic. So in my recent work on the photographic, I've really picked a fight with the usual suspects for how to think about photographs. If you go to Berger or to Sontag or to Roland Barthes, there's a use of the archaeological metaphor of the photograph as a frozen moment in time, as a sort of artifact that we receive into the present. It's essentially a fairly straightforward idea over reception theory. But in fact, as an archaeologist, that isn't how I see objects. I see objects and understand objects as human endurances. They're not frozen moments of time, they're ongoing durations. So maybe the photograph works the same, and maybe a photograph, I've argued, can be understood not as a frozen moment of time, but an endurance. And actually, I mean, maybe in some ways that's also how we should understand the museum as well. So that's some background intellectually to sort of where I'm aiming to go with some of this, because really this is a talk which is about, obviously, the patriarchy. It's about the sheer whiteness of our discipline, and so the dead white man on the surface of it is Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, to whom a memorial is built here at the Pitt Rivers. But obviously, I guess a natural thing to do would be to talk about my privilege and my positionality here. But it's certainly the case that to state your privilege can be to underline it and reinstate it. And to describe your positionality can be to sort of not accept that a position can be not occupied, or it can be moved, or maybe it can be excavated, or maybe a position can be undermined. So in many ways, this talk is an exercise in seeking to undermine myself. So where anthropology's sort of cultural turn offered us the language of positionality, of having a perspective on the world, and where the ontological turn maybe offered us a perspectival multinaturalism, I want to talk today not about a turn, but a return to the museum and an acknowledgement of the returns that are happening in our museums that are of ancestral remains and also of objects. So I want to argue that we've overstated the degree to which anthropology left the museum in its past, so we can understand what endures in the present from those times. And I want to talk about anthropology as a subject, not purely a discipline. This is about the embodied nature of the knowledge that we make in anthropology. We're all aware, as we've learned from Martin Holbart and others have observed that anthropology to some degree is an experiment we undertake with ourselves. We take the body somewhere, you know, in order to gain knowledge. And certainly the archaeologist is more than aware, you know, of that embodied sort of you know, nature of excavation. But you know, I want to say there's a crisis at this point, and a failure not only for the Colonial Museum, but also maybe for the figure of who is the body, who is the subject, who is the human, how do we understand that human at the heart of anthropology. So when things fail, as we learn from STS and other such fields, we see them. So you're on your way to work and the car won't start, and suddenly you see the car in a way that morning that you wouldn't see it on any other sort of normal morning. So failure has something to do with sort of seeing. And maybe that's also something that's happening to the human and to life and to death at this moment that we find ourselves in. You know, at this point, at this wider cultural moment, but also at the point for anthropology. So that's the positionality, that's where I'm speaking from. And as I say, sort of one of the things I'm aiming to do is to undermine myself. I'm working in an institution that was organized on a principle of the evolution of objects, of sort of cultural objects, of the attempt to extend ideas of improvement and evolution from the world of sort of nature into the world of objects, in this case of weapons, which of course was at the foundational idea of Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers' account, you know, of how things alter over time. He was a soldier anthropologist, and he sought, as we have argued over the years, as has been observed, he sought to understand human diversity, not in terms of natural difference, but in terms of the different histories of objects, of technology. And, you know, in many ways, that sort of, you know, liberal humanism that we have identified in him and often identified with, I want to argue is sort of a part of what is now in crisis, a part of what we're now seeing and what's failing at the heart of anthropology. But certainly this idea of the cultural evolution of objects was not just a fairly conventional Victorian improvement narrative. It was sort of grounded fundamentally in that notion of the improvement of sort of weapons. So I guess it was no surprise that in 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall movement observed that the Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford. So what happened in 2015, of course, came out of the experience in South Africa, whereby a generation on from the end of apartheid, which of course ended in 1994, there was an experience of the young people who were at university, at UCT, they continued to experience institutional racism. You know, so they were born after the end of apartheid. And at the heart of that movement, at the heart of campus, was a large image of Rhodes, of the imperialists, the mass murderer, and the diamond miner, the founder of Rhodesia that was named after him, and so forth. And the physical removal of that white infrastructure and all of the ways in which it naturalized, but also made to endure a certain ideology, was at the heart of anti-racism for that movement. So in the fall of 2015, the same individuals involved in those movements found themselves in Oxford because of the Rhodes funding, and found another statue of Rhodes at the heart of Oxford's Academy. The movement that operated from 2015 onwards increasingly pointed out the persistence of empire that had actively been sort of built into the fabric of our academy, from the naming of libraries after Caribbean slave owners, obviously to Rhodes himself, but also to the museum as well at the Pitt Rivers. So what Achille Mbembe at the time, in describing the South African Rhodes Must Fall movement, described as a negative moment, which is a moment when where antagonisms emerge, even though old ones, or actually while old ones remain unresolved. That was something that we felt absolutely at the, directly here at the Pitt Rivers, because it was the focus on the displays of the museum and the lines being linked and connected up in between our role in the academy and the wider movements asking, why is the curriculum white? Why isn't my professor black? So we have at the heart of this a sense here in Oxford that we felt, which we've seen elsewhere as well over this sort of time, in which the building in of what I'm calling white infrastructure in the form of objects in the museum was understood as a form in which an older view of anthropology was built to last. And here at the Pitt Rivers, one of the central roles, of course, has been to physically dismantle that white infrastructure. Because I guess, if I think back to 2014 to 15, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves at that point. We had hosted source communities, we had returned ancestral objects to Maori communities, to First Nations. We'd hosted we'd hosted a visit by the Haida, a number of members of the Haida Nation. We'd held a potlatch on the anthropology lawn. We'd done all of the work we thought was important for rehumanizing a space like the Pitt Rivers. And suddenly, around these sort of objects, the cases of objects that were taken with violence and displayed to sort of, to tell a story of cultural supremacy, we suddenly realized that the displays themselves were hurtful in the present. They were exclusionary. They were allowing a certain vision from anthropology's past to persist into the present. So it's that sense in which it was not just, though, the physical side of the museum. It was the sense in which the museum almost like the aperture of a camera. If we understand the photograph as an endurance, if we understand an object as an endurance, actually the museum itself institutionally is something in which sort of time, as it were, sort of thickens, as if it were to take on flesh. It becomes artistically visible. And so space becomes charged and responsive to movements of time and plot and history. So I've tried to write about some of this through the notion of the necrographic, of writing not just histories of objects over time, of the life history of the object. There's no more faithful idiom, I guess, for material culture studies than the idea of the social life of things. But in writing about these histories and understanding them in the present, I've found that sort of positive model of objects moving from one context into another and having an additional layer added onto them, actually really problematic and really inappropriate. When you're talking about cultural dispossession, when in the case of the Benin, attack of the 1890s, this is the desecration of sacred sites. It is the killing of tens of thousands of individuals. It's the taking of objects in order to take sovereignty, in order to destroy traditional religion, in order to dispossess or seek to dispossess a whole culture, in order to display art objects, sacred objects, royal objects from a living culture as if they were archaeological. All of that means that we need something like the necrological, the knowledge of loss and death. We need to write necrographies. And of course, that was inspired by Achille Mbembe's account, his sort of reworking of the Foucauldian notion of the biopolitical, whereby he says, okay, so Foucault talks about the politics of life in the hospital or in the prison, but in the context of forced migration from Africa and the Middle East, where there are people dying in the Mediterranean every year, we need a politics of who gets to live and who dies, which is what Mbembe calls the necropolitical. So I want to link that in this talk to sort of wider critiques of the biocentrism that we can see, which really revolves around the Sylvia Wynter account of moving beyond what she calls man one and man two. So according to Wynter, what we need is to recognize how the Renaissance and the religious model of sort of man on a universal basis was displaced in the 19th century by a person she calls man two, who maybe we'd identify as anthropos, and she certainly identifies as homo economus. It's a universal model of humanity, which she argues has simply sought to slot the world into a single sort of category in a very sort of unhelpful way. So humanity is at the heart of this. When we've mistaken Augustus Pitt Rivers for someone who was anti-racist because he resisted the idea of sort of difference on a physical model, he talked about cultural difference. What we're doing in many ways is we are arguing in favor of that model of man two, that model of the universal humanity, which is maybe in its own sense, because it's built on a Western model, as we learned from Wynter, is actually really problematic. So what does this mean for the anthropological canon? How can we, I've outlined how we're thinking in museums, how we're seeking to dismantle some of not just the objects, but by actually that process to dismantle the persistent ideas of the past, the fact that these ideas from anthropology's past are with us in the present. What does this mean for other fields? And of course, we have to start with Ryan Jobson's account, his critique of the Boasian fix, as he puts it, and the case for letting anthropology burn. So I think we're still, this incredibly important paper and events it's inspired since are fundamentally at the heart of this sort of crisis that mirrors the failure of the Colonial Museum within the wider discipline. And what's failing, I want to argue, and certainly Jobson argues, is in part our conception of humanity. Meanwhile, what have we been doing with the canon? Let's flip back to 2017 and the so-called emeritus rant from the much missed Marshall Salins, who just recently died, amazingly sadly. But his argument, which is a common one we hear, where he argued, where have all the cultures gone? Why do we not teach the canon? Why do we not teach the key concepts in anthropology anymore? Of course, a lot of people came back and said, well, actually, these things are being taught around the world. But how, as a journal, of course, back in 2017, which seems like an age away now, if we think about how these conversations have advanced, how ran this very interesting set of responses that now I have to say seem incredibly in a time warp from the past, about asking, why do we read the classics? Fast forward to 2018, and the Cambridge Journal of Anthropology had a themed issue on the question of the decolonization of anthropology, of what we teach. And in the afterword, Ghassan Haj described his earlier account of how we ought to respect our elders. And he argued that his earlier call to do so was a call to refuse the attempt to celebrate false, fresh starts for the discipline. So reading those papers actually back now in the present moment, you know, I think is incredibly informative. So there's essentially in those papers, there's a set of people saying we shouldn't remove the classics, the Marcel Mauses or the Malinowskis or whoever. And there are other people saying, no, 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 that's not what we're saying. We just want to add in more voices. So I want to suggest that that binary, you know, really isn't enough, and to suggest that maybe there are ways of reading which are not, which are rather more like the dismantling of a museum or the toppling of a statue. Because remember, Rhodes Must Fall began by re-centering Cecil Rhodes, but in a very different way. So are there ways of reading and writing anthropology that seek to break this notion of the decolonization of the curriculum by just adding in, and it's an important task, you know, adding in voices from outside the Euro-American centers of anthropology? Of course, that work has to be done. But is there also something more radical to take apart how we write about and think about these ongoing pasts? Because the problem for Pitt Rivers is that nobody reads him anymore. So that idea that you could decolonize the curriculum by either taking him out or putting him in, he's not there on the reading list. He's there in completely different ways. He's there in the framing of the four-field model. He's there in the naming of the museum. So this, I want to argue, is about how a particular form of 19th century liberal humanism becomes embodied and inherited, how it erases some human lives and it elevates others. This is about, in the museum, something that maybe we see more generally in anthropology, a differential treatment of the dead. Some who are remembered sort of by name in the museum, and others who are physically on display, and the physical displays of the black and the brown bodies that died under colonialism, that found their way into the museum and remain here unburied. So I want to give you two examples of sort of what this means in practice. And I want, in doing so, to observe that, I guess what I'm saying in the museum context builds on the Joseph Roach observation that the dead can be made to endure as occasions for memory and invention. It's the performative and the embodied nature of how the dead can be made to persist. We might go to Levi-Strauss's observation about the commonality between music and myth, which maybe we also see in the museum, to serve to immobilize the passage of time and so overcome the differences, the oppositions between historical and elapsed time. Maybe that's a part of the trick the museum does, and maybe the discipline more generally does, through embodied memory and an attempt to reproduce. So my first example is the medalettes. So this is Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers medalettes, which he had specially made to date stamp and to put in the excavation trenches, you know, as he was going to backfill them. So he leaves these sort of medals with a very unique design on them of the pick and the funerary urn and the skull and the axe and the dagger and the level to undertake archaeological survey. Here's an unstamped one that says the fact that he opened a trench, and so here's an excavated one, excavated 100 years after he buried it in 1884 at an excavation on the South Lodge site. So this is an example of how sort of Pitt Rivers is actively intervening in the archaeological record, actively seeking to move his voice, his intention forward in that sort of way. Here's the same image on the casket of his cremated remains in Wiltshire. So that's one one example where I want us just to consider the difference between the unstamped and the stamped medalettes, and the museum which he built, named after him, for his posterity as well. And then the second story is one about Henry Balfour, the curator of the Pitt Rivers, from the moment in which it was founded in 1884 up to 1939. So this is a story that I was told when I first arrived at the Pitt Rivers in 2007. So in the first few days of being here, someone told me the story of Henry Balfour working late at night in the Pitt Rivers. It was a Sunday night and there was no one else around, and he was working on some arrows which were poisoned, and he pricked his finger with the arrow, and there was no sense in which he could get help, so he simply he sat down with a paper and pen in order to write down actually whatever effect happened to the body. And the time passed and nothing happened. So he interpreted that as the fact that the passage of time had led to the poison no longer being efficient. And Henry Balfour, used to tell this story in his annual lectures. So why was I told this story, and what did it mean? At first, I was thinking about which of these objects they might be, because there are quite a few poisoned arrows, but not that many in the Pitt Rivers. And so was it these objects that came in 1912 that were poisoned by inserting the arrow into a decomposing human corpse? Most likely it was these objects that were given in 1930, which were poisoned arrows where the correspondence with the Reverend Harry Arthur Blair, who was a district commissioner in what's now Ghana, went into a lot of detail about the deadliness of the poison and talked about the fact that these were objects that were confiscated, in a military expedition that took the bows and arrows away, and he was happy to supply them. So what do the medalettes and the poison arrow stories tell us about how knowledge works in the museum, not just objects? So in part, I think, both objects, certainly the poison, is about what Rob Nixon would call slow violence, the hazardous nature of objects in the museum, their ongoing latent hurt. Maybe part of what I was being told in this initiative sort of conversation about the history of the museum was that the museum is able to hurt you or hurt others. But there was also a sort of white projection, as I call it in my most recent book, a sort of switching of position. So it was the curator that would be hurt, rather than actually, while sort of concealing the wider hurt that, of course, had been undertaken in the taking of those arrows and in the loss of life. So these are examples maybe of how institutionally the necropolitical, the necrographic work, this is at the heart of it, sort of maybe how the thing that Richard Farden talked about in 1990, that he described as the two Malinowskis, the idea that when we think about someone like Malinowski, at one point we sort of treat him as a disciplinary ancestor, at another point we treat him as if he is a contemporary, because we can look at at the ethnographic information that he recorded about exchange, but we look at the functionalism and we see that in the past. So there's a time juggling that goes on. Maybe what we're seeing here with these stories are a sort of a distributed personhood over time rather than space. And certainly I have to say, in these cases, I'm quite sympathetic with the comment from Ingold that the notion of a museum ethnography, when there are only curated objects, seems oxymoronic. So rather than trying to humanize the museums in the way that maybe we have done in the past, we need to recognize the forms of humanity that have been imposed, and to think about the different forms of the human in the present. So we can't avoid, when talking about this haunting, these ancestral presences, it's hard to avoid the observation that the idea of whites as the ancestors returning or as ghosts is something that we see across ethnographic materials around the world. So anthropologists have often described, actually, whether it's in the film First Contact in 1983, whether you go to Axelton in the Congo, arguably to some degree, this is part of what's going on in the Sarlin's account of the death of Cook. You see it in some of the discussion over cargo cults. That sense that the first encounter situation is often one in which the whites are understood as representing the dead. They're already, dead white men in the field. So go to books like this example, like People You See in a Dream. The sense in a New Guinean context of Europeans understood as coming from outside the human realm, the world of the living, spirits from the past, the return of the ancestors, the sheer ghostly nature of their whiteness, of course, is in part a question over categorization. The Europeans had the pre-prepared category of inverted commas native, but also a sense of how those natives were somehow from the past. They're described as being in the Stone Age. And equally, there's the characterization from the New Guinean point of view of outsiders who appear as if in a dream, as something other than human, as ghosts arriving, as beings who come from outside the edges of the world, from the land of death, from the sky, some even recognized as a dead relative returning to reclaim an outstanding debt. And of course, we can also go to Levi-Strauss's famous sort of passage, much appropriated in the discussions over multinaturalism, which is in the Caribbean, where there's that sense of encounters where people even go as far as to deprive the outsider of this last degree of reality by making a ghost or an apparition of him. And in that passage, Levi-Strauss talks about how that can lead to new forms of sort of cruelty because of the lack of acceptance of a certain model of humanity. So the photograph and the museum, and maybe anthropology itself, in the way that these descriptions of ghosts find their way into the anthropological literature, represent then technologies of duration. That notion from Gerhard Richter of the photograph, of how what the photograph mourns is both a death and a survival, a disappearance and also a living on, an erasure from and inscription in the archive of its technically mediated memory. So to what extent is that what happens not only in photographs, but in museums and also in the discipline of anthropology? To what extent are we dealing with what Roland Barthes talks about as that very subtle moment when, to tell the truth, I am neither subject nor object, but rather a subject who feels himself becoming an object. I am then living a micro experience of a death. I am really becoming a ghost. How does the archive make that happen? So all those points have already been made far more eloquently than by me in the Sylvia Winter piece that she has written and that she wrote in 2003 about unsettling the coloniality of being. Her notion of rethinking the human, of the human, after man in inverted commas, of the over-representation of that form of man. And of course, she in turn is sort of drawing from Fanon's observation that there is a drama in the so-called human sciences. Should we posit a standard human reality or try to and then try to describe its psychological modalities? Or should we not relentlessly try to achieve a concrete and ever-changing understanding of man? And then Fanon moves on to talk about a capitulation of man. That's sort of Western model of man as human. And of course, if we think about the Pitt Rivers case, if we think about cultural and social anthropology more generally, his crucial observation of the difference between what he calls vulgar racism, that's based merely on the body, on the skin, on the skulls in the museum, and cultural racism, which involves the taking and the raids and the murder and everything we see with empire. So when the Pitt Rivers takes apart and removes human remains from the museum, the skulls, the bone, the hair, the specimens of skin, the physical remains of the black and brown people who died under colonialism and find themselves in a museum. We're dismantling a certain condition of humanity. We're also making other incredibly problematic categorizations, such as the difference between unmodified human remains and those objects which are composites, are made up of other bits of human as well. But this is a conversation we're now seeing at the Peabody about the sheer number of human individuals represented in Harvard's collections. The identification of the 20,000, 15 at least are of African descent who were enslaved African Americans. That's a conversation now moving to Penn around the Mawson Cranial Collection, where it's been shown that a number of those objects, a number of the skulls were excavated from a burial ground that is located right next door to Penn Museum, and these African Americans continue, and their remains continue to be in the museum at this moment. We've seen also in the Penn context about as recently as 1985, the physical remains of two children who were killed in the bombing of the Move House actually remain in the museum and are being used for teaching at an Ivy League. It's an online course in which they were used. So I've just written about that last week in The Guardian. And Tamara Lanier, of course, has gone further to make the case that the photographs of her ancestors in the Harvard Museum are her property, because they were taken in the way that objects were taken, in the way that human remains were taken as well. So we of course have to underline as well the unnaming of Crowber Hall. And I think this is where we begin to see how the threads that I've offered you maybe can be woven together. That sense of the physical presence of humanity made to be in different forms. In the Pitt Rivers, in the naming of Crowber Hall, we saw the Seligman campaign at LSE recently to unname after Seligman. These are very different ways of treating the dead as compared to the skulls and the hair and the physical remains. So this is a question of actually seeking to update, our notions of the human. Who counts as human? How do we think about alternative categories of how humanity is enacted if we're going to see and expose the inhumanities of our institutions? So in the final minutes available to me, I just want to make a set of connections between the failure of the Anthropology Museum as a visual moment, as I said it was at the start, and the failure of anthropology more generally, and what do we do next? So my colleague Nick Mirzoeff has made the incredibly important observation, and this is in an account of the BLM movement, not as it unfolded in its most recent phase last year, but after the racist killings of Eric Garner and Michael Brown from the summer of 2014 up to 2017. He, in this book that you can read online, actually makes the point that those events were a product of a fundamental shift in sort of visual technologies. So the presence of the dashcam footage and cell phone footage meant that anti-Black violence that has been happening for centuries could suddenly be seen and could be shared. And out of that, a politics sort of came. And most recently, only last month, after the racist killing of George Floyd and the verdict on that killing, crucially, the Attorney General said, I would not call today's verdict a justice, because justice implies true restoration. What it is accountability, which is a first step towards justice. In the context of returning objects, what we're doing at the Pitt Rivers is seeking to use our esoteric knowledge that we have available to us to share knowledge of physically where the Benin objects are in this example, so that conversations about return, about the dismantling of the white infrastructure in each of these locations can be undertaken. The information is in other people's hands. There's a connection that I'm trying to draw in my work in that area, in between the act of saying, someone's name, the idea of seeing that comes with the visual, to the idea of listing, the idea of opening up the discipline in order to start to dismantle it. So the physical dismantling of the white infrastructure of the Colonial Museum is happening at Crowber Hall, which of course inside that building is the Phoebe Hearst Museum of the University of Berkeley, but also the return from the University of Aberdeen and increasing numbers of institutions of the Benin Bronzes. What does this mean in my final 2 minutes or so for the decolonization of knowledge in anthropology, for decolonizing what we teach, for decolonizing what I'm calling the subject rather than purely the discipline? So the Rose Must Fall movement, both in Cape Town and in Oxford, re-centered a dead white man in order to dismantle racist infrastructure. That re-centering, the seeing, the pointing out is not an undoing, but it is an accountability that started the process of removing an enduring, a decomposing, and a poisonous and a memorialized perspective, no longer fit for our times. They're like the poison arrows. They're like the medalettes that have the date stamps. So the decolonization process cannot be simply about adding further perspectives, more references to the reading list, however important that is, of course. That would be akin in the museum to just rewriting the label next to every stolen object, or rewriting a new label next to every racist label. The ideology of retain and explain would simply give us stagnation through contextualization. Compare this to the archaeologist's description of relationships in between features as they develop over time. Some interfaces are what we call a positive interface, which is a layer upon a layer. It's the interface in between two layers that build up. But others are negative interfaces. They are cuts. And crucially, a cut has no substance. It's a relation. It's a relationship in between the feel of a cut and the material into which that cut was made, but the cut itself, is a taking away. And that's how archaeological sites sort of build, and maybe it's how knowledge can also build as well. So decolonization is about the anti-racist moment we find ourselves in across Europe. Fundamentally, we're at a moment that we could compare to the civil rights movement of the 1970s, in that in a North American context, the observation then was that racism has a history, and that history includes enslavement. Now in the 2020s across Europe, we still have institutional racism, no matter what the government wished to say in their reports. And that institutional racism we're increasingly seeing, a bit like the South African observation, that a generation on from apartheid, institutional racism is there still. For us, that presence has a history, and that racism's history is empire. That means that anthropology museums, and perhaps arguably, and I would argue, anthropology as a subject, are crucial spaces in which the work of understanding and dismantling and in time repair will happen. So the history of anthropology has too often been written as if we were erecting a statue, as if looting a continent, as if claiming territory, as if speaking over others, as if embracing theories that treat people as if they were equivalent to things. And I would include that in all of the literature that we have now about the non-human, about the relational ontologies, all that material, which is so worryingly simply repeating the dehumanizing tropes that we've seen before. So this is not simply about what's on the reading list, in the same way as it's not only about what's on display. It's about institutional lives. It's about what's in the storerooms, who works in the museum, the voices of the communities and the stakeholders and audiences, and us letting go, and me as a curator undermining my authority in every way I can. So it's certainly possible, I hope, that anthropologists might read and write as if they were tearing down a statue, as if they were returning a stolen object, as if they were asking what can and can't be seen, as if they were interrogating personhoods that are not simply distributed but shattered, reading and writing in order to cut a network when that network is one of dissent, not alliance. It's about those aspects of partiality that are a privilege only in one direction of operation, and they are a fragmentation or a dispossession in the other. It's about a partiality that we risk in that it's missing stuff out and it's reinscribing hurt in the present. And so I'm going to finish there. And I just want to actually to thank, Aisling and Will and the whole of the committee for their input and their authorship of this acknowledgement. And, this acknowledgement, as it says, is also about acknowledgements and actions. So I'm hoping that in this lecture, what I've said about the crisis of the museum and the failure of the museum having a relationship to the failure of our model of the human, and how thinking about anthropology as a subject as much as it is simply a discipline might help us work out how we continue this important work of anti-racism in our discipline. Thanks very much.